thank you very much, Sarah. And again, just another level deeper into this digital health reset that we're seeing along the lines of payer, provider, pharma, and most importantly, patient. And to talk about that and to talk about one of the underlying components of all of those different relationships is data, and how data is the new currency in healthcare, and how important that is to not just understand where it is and how we can use it, but also to ensure that we have the highest level of integrity when we are using data and helping it to improve patient outcomes, access, and accessibility. Really the heart of all the work we do at HITLAB around the world. One of the world experts to talk about this is someone who is truly the architects of this new digital health infrastructure that we're seeing, someone who's been building it through building partnerships, funding these massive programs with one of the world's largest digital healthcare funds, is Bill Taranto from the Merck Global Health Innovation Fund. Bill.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening I know there's a lot of people on Zoom from wherever you're calling in. I appreciate you allowing me to speak to you today. I'm going to try to do something to walk the stage a little bit, not because I have anything against podiums, but because I have the Italian affliction where I have to move when I speak, and I can't stand at the podium. For those of you who heard me speak before, and those of you who haven't, as Stan said, my name is Bill Taranto, and I'm president of the Merck Global Health Innovation Fund. And we're one of Merck's funds that's 100% dedicated to digital health. One of our primary investment thesis that we have used since we started the fund, and something I actually was developing before I joined Merck, was that we have this idea that data is the currency we're going to use to transact in the future healthcare market. And what that means is if you actually looked at our portfolio, every single one of our companies are actually data companies, whether they're capturing data, throwing off data, analyzing data, monitoring data, accessing patient data. It's all about data to us. And that's really one of our primary investment thesis. And then when I was talking to Stan, one of the things that we realized, we've never actually probably talked about, well, why is that one of our investment thesis? And what does it really mean to the pharmaceutical industry and the healthcare industry when we talk about data and why it's important? So what I'm going to cover today is just kind of why do I think, and why does the fund think that this is an important concept about really data being that currency we're going to use to transact in the future healthcare market. See if we can get this to, all right. Maybe I'm not doing this. There we go. So there's a lot of things happening in data. There's tons of data coming from all around, whether it's electronic medical records, Internet of Things, telehealth, remote monitoring, all the omics, AI, consumer health. It's a tremendous amount of healthcare data that's being generated. And part of the problem is, what do we do with all that data? But if you actually looked at all the data that was generated last year, it's amazing that if you stacked it up, it's the equivalent of over 2 million miles high of stacked CD-ROMs. It's just a tremendous amount of data that's being generated. And the question is, how do we turn that data into something useful or make it an outcome that's important to the industry? So the first trend I want to talk about is sort of the movement to value-based care. And this is a really busy slide. And my point is, I'm not going to talk about everything on this slide, but I just want to point out a couple things. On my or your left, what's interesting is that half the payers and providers, are really interested in moving to value-based contracts, but we kind of see that a majority of them have actually implemented, a small amount of these contracts to date. And the reason for that really is it's not easy to do because you need analytics, technology, and people to do that. And a lot of the payers and providers don't have the infrastructure yet to fully implement these kinds of tools moving forward. And they also have concerns about, how they're going to measure outcomes. They have concerns about containing costs. And the real question is, does this actually really work? So a lot of them aren't quite sure that it works, but they feel that they need to move to this type of contracting. And again, to do this, this really is all going to be centered around the use of data. But the key thing is really just following the money. What are the trends, and whether you're fee for service, whether you're paying individually for all these services, whether it's pre-admission, Part A, Part B, post-acute care, or readmissions, or you're moving to this value-based model where it's a fully integrated payment system. The punchline is it actually doesn't really matter at all which model you're using. Because in both models, payers use healthcare data to determine what they're going to pay for. And what that leads to is ultimately data is that currency we're going to use to transact in the future healthcare market. We've got to have data, but we have to have data in a way that can be used to drive an outcome. That's the ultimate piece of the technology that is the hardest piece to do moving forward. So I want to give you kind of an example of one company, and for full transparency, this company is in our portfolio. It's a company called Datavant. And what's interesting is they're tokenizing across 500 plus multimodal data sources in order to get a longitudinal patient data view that's not only secure, but safe. And for life science companies, this is important to us. So it can help us maybe identify, do better patient identification, better patient stratification, better drug performance. Providers can enable population health, care pathway design. Then we see payers can understand risk, fraud prevention, and value-based contracting. But the way to really think about it is just, it's a tremendous amount of structured and unstructured data that's being generated. And then, their secret sauce is how do they just take all this disparate data and turn it into something meaningful and something that each of these players in the industry can use to drive better outcomes. And again, ultimately, that's what it's about, is to drive better outcomes within the industry. But there's a lot of these type of companies. Datavant isn't the only one. And we'll get to that, in a minute of what's happening in the industry. But I want to talk a little bit about why this is really important to the pharmaceutical industry. We not only generate a tremendous amount of data through our clinical studies and all the work that we do, but we buy a lot of data as well in order to do a lot of things to help the value chain. And whether you're talking through pre-approval, post-approval, or the ecosystem infrastructure, there's a lot of use cases that pharma's interested in working on, and these are pretty universal to most pharmaceutical companies. It's not just Merck only. But the key thing is, but what's the value? And I think if you start to think about drug development, that's one of the most key areas that we're interested in the use of data, because we're trying to design and execute smarter clinical trials where we have better products, cheaper and faster approvals, and longer product lifespan. That's kind of the big piece that pharma is driving towards. So we see a lot of investments in this particular part of the space, whether it's AI for drug discovery, where we're trying to do better patient identification, patient stratification. We're trying to identify new molecules. It's probably one of the more important spaces of which data is becoming important. Market access and value, can we demonstrate the product value? That's still a common practice within pharma, whether it's patient access support or pharmacoeconomic evidence. We're still trying to drive, what that meaningful value is for the use of the product. And then we have the patient and provider experience, where we're enhancing outcomes, and whether it's expanded indications, optimizing product use, or even reduce side effects. Again, that's all based on how we look at data and how we have access to data and how we can use that data in a way that provides better value to the industry. We're moving towards precision medicine. It's still early within precision medicine, but we certainly have tools in the diagnostic market that allow us to, again, better identify patients, better identify conditions, but it also can lead to better products. And really, I think most importantly to pharma is that right patient, right place, right time concept. That's what we're driving towards. And again, this whole data concept is around establishing that. And of course, the digital infrastructure, real world evidence, real world data is the primary infrastructure of how we're going to move forward with all these value propositions across the pharma value chain. So again, when you look at this, even for our industry, again, it just shows you when we use that term, data is the currency. Without the right types of data, we can't do any of this in the right way that we want to do it. And thinking about how we move forward in the future is how we have better access, better curation, better analytics, around data and what we can do with it as an industry. So let's talk about a little bit about real world data and the kind of companies that play within this space. You kind of have three different sort of offerings. You have sort of companies that are data focused, those that have more of that hybrid offering where it's more access to usable data, and then you have sort of the insight focused companies. And the way this chart works is sort of the blue dot just represents right now what one might consider leaders within these respective sort of spaces. And this is just a small sampling. This is not even close to the sheer number of companies that are playing within this space. But what you see though is working across the value chain from pre-approval to post-approval. And the most companies sit in sort of that hybrid offering space is what we've seen to date. And as I mentioned earlier, Datavant is one of our portfolio companies, but there's certainly lots of different companies that do a lot of different things across the value chain. The least kind of companies we see is sort of this insight focus only company. In reality, is the reason you see the hybrid sort of model is it allows these companies to drive the most revenue and build the most capabilities they can build. But again, I think what you're seeing is and I'll show you in a few slides sort of what's happening within the market. This RWE space is probably one of the fastest growing space in the data space and what these companies can do, not only for our industry, but for the entire healthcare industry. So if we look at some of the business models, you kind of have three sort of business models that are out there. You got ones that focus serially on data, those that focus, only on technology, and those that focus on the services. And what's interesting is the technology only focused ones is kind of rare. We don't really see a lot of them. And it's really the lack of in-house staffing needed to use the technology. It's hard to find data scientists, hard to find the right people to do that kind of work. So we tend to see more on what would be your left-hand side, the data side of the type of companies. And it matches, again, what we saw on the previous slide, where you have then the middle group that does that more hybrid sort of approach. And then very few so far on the full service side, partly simply because there's more revenue to be generated if you're on the data side, but you still need all three of these to work. That's the key what this slide is talking about. In order to, really drive that data being the currency, you've got to have the data, the technology, and the services all combined to try to deliver what the end user wants to be delivered. And again, just an interesting number of companies that probably most of you all have seen or know. But what's kind of interesting as an investor, which I am, is what's happening within the market. There's a tremendous amount of M&A activity in this space. This is probably the space that has the largest valuations of any digital health space, the most activity that's happening. And part of it is just because there's tremendous amounts of revenue to be generated from this area. And so what we see is, lots of M&A activity. As I said earlier, we were part of Ciox, which got acquired by Datavant. That's why we're in Datavant today. We're an investor also in Trinetics today still, even though Carlyle acquired them, but we stayed in to work with Carlyle to help build the company further. And what set it all off, probably originally back in 2018 was Roche acquisition of Flatiron. And what ended up happening is the industry needed a response to what was happening with that acquisition. Pharma didn't want to be dependent only on one sort of data provider, partly because that there could be a potential breach at some point, and just having a single pharma owning that capability led to pharma then pushing for different types of companies in this space, and that's why you're seeing this proliferation of companies. And the fundraising has been unbelievable. We saw last year and maybe even the year before some outrageous valuations in a lot of the digital health space. But I think where we saw the valuations sort of be able to match the revenue and where they have held strong is within this space. And you can just see the raising that's going on in the valuation and the amount of capital raised. It takes a tremendous amount of capital to build these types of companies to do the things that they want to do. but they don't have any problem raising the capital they need to raise, and they actually do have the valuations to support the capital raise that they're doing. So what this should just tell you is, if you're an entrepreneur or an investor, this is actually an interesting space to be in. It's a good space to build companies. It's a good space to make money if you're an entrepreneur. And of course, it's a good space to make money if you're an investor like myself. But more importantly, what we're building is really good companies that service the right part of the industry and a company that's needed. One of the things that we talk about when we invest for GHI is making sure that these assets exist in the world. And it's not so much for Merck to acquire them, it's about Merck working with them and learning how to use the capabilities to make them a better company. And it's okay if our competitors use them, because the secret sauce is what each of these companies do with them. But we need these types of companies to exist in the world. And that's why we invest in them. But the market's showing that, from a payer provider and pharma industry, they want these companies to exist as well. So it's a really big industry raising a lot of capital, and hopefully as these mature, providing the type of services that the industry needs and provides the outcomes that we're looking for. So that was my talk. I know we only have a couple minutes left. I didn't know if anybody had any questions for me. So I left a couple minutes for questions, and I'm next on a panel, but if anybody had any questions around this particular topic, I'm happy to answer them. Might have to come up to the mic.
Hello. Hi. I'll make them two brief questions, hopefully. One is, there seems to be a new type of startup that's starting to come into the ecosystem, a company called Seekster, another company called Pluto, where they're taking a decentralized or federated approach and pulling that data so that way it's not stored in one place, so it's more secure. Some of their ONC certified. Do you see that disrupting or adding on to the ecosystem as it currently exists? And then the other is, there's a huge amount of privacy laws that are starting to come into play in terms of accessing data, where patients are now taking active roles and looking through consent as to how that data is being gathered. So while you have companies that are now leveraging that data and trying to build assets on top of it, you have more activism that's trying to mirror what's happening in Europe with GDPR and figure out where is that data coming, who is accessing my data, and how is it being used. Do you see that affecting the ecosystem? Thank you.
Yeah. So on the first question, I think I see it as an add-on, but one of the things we're also seeing in this industry is consolidation. No one company, does 100% of everything. And what they find is they need to fill their gaps. So I think these potential sort of add-on companies, they're not disruptive in it all. They're additive. And I think eventually they're good acquisition targets to fill in, the gaps that are missing. I think on the data privacy, I think that's always going to be an issue. I just recently did a trip to Germany. It's interesting there that, they don't even have EMRs yet there, and their data security and privacy laws are extremely strict, at least compared to what you see here. I think for a good thing, regulatory is going to help the situation. I think it's really interesting how patients take more control of their data. It's one thing to have their, access to your own data. It's another thing to understand what any of and all that means and what kind of decision making you have around that. But I still think any regulatory and compliance rules around HIPAA and data security and privacy and storage is important for this industry. And interestingly enough, that's a kind of even a whole nother set of sort of investments you can make that are outside of just these sort of data companies. There's a whole host of companies that just specialize in that one area of data security, privacy, and storage. So I just look at it as the more, the better, the stricter, the better. We want to protect patient privacy and patient data, but these companies aren't going anywhere anytime soon. So they're just gonna be more regulated, I think, as time goes on. Any other questions? Nope. Okay.
Hi, Bill. I'm Rama from LockCube. My question relates to the technology absorption barriers that are there in our industry. You know, historically, we've been a little reluctant. COVID has pushed it. Given your experience and expertise, how do you see the lay of the land out there in the future in terms of speed of technology absorption by the pharma and the life science industry?
I think it depends on, for pharma, it depends on the technology. For example, in the sort of the e-clinical space, the clinical trial space, we're slower to adopt the new technology, not because the technology doesn't work, but we have a tried and true way of doing clinical trials, and it's difficult to make that sort of switch. So I think you'll find, in that space, probably adoption is going to be a lot slower. I think in other areas, like as it relates to RWD, as it relates, to the use of technology and drug discovery, you're seeing a lot more faster adoption. In fact, we're making a lot of investments in early stage AI and drug discovery. We're still making a lot of sort of that real world evidence, real world data investments. We really haven't done much in the clinical trial space, partly because we're not sure how it's going to evolve. And again, what the adoption is. So I think it's just dependent on what the technology is and what at least pharma's viewpoint on adopting it. We also see, like in the DTX market, for example, there's slow adoption so far from pharma in that space, and partly probably because it gets to the clinical trial question. We're used to doing, a double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial, and a lot of these DTXs don't necessarily follow that rigor, but we kind of want that rigor to happen. And so, you don't necessarily see the adoption as of yet until they maybe follow the rigor of what we're used to with the therapeutic. And then certainly, in those types of tools that, the profit pool is less than a therapeutic. So there's a lot of different reasons why you'll see adoption happening or not happening within the pharma industry. But, I think as it relates, to your question, it's more of it depends on the type of technology.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. I know we have a panel to do, so I thank you very much. Appreciate your time today. I'm here all day, so if you have any other questions for me, just pull me aside. I'm happy to chat with all of you. Thank you.